Hey everyone, Josh Hawkins here. This is episode 35 of Opening Up the Gospels. In the last two episodes, we looked at Matthew 3 and Luke 3, and I began to introduce who John the Baptist was. We saw that the Gospel writers not only introduced John like the Old Testament prophets, but they also tell us that he dressed like them and he spoke like them too. As we'll see, this is why the crowds and the Jewish authorities throughout the Gospels often refer to John in this way. Remember, there hadn't been a prophet in Israel for over 400 years, and all of a sudden John bursts on the scene and ignites the whole nation with expectation again. And as we'll see as we move forward, John was much more than a prophet. He was preparing the way for Yahweh. Today I want to continue looking at John the Baptist, but I want to go through a little history lesson that'll give us some very important and contextual information and help us better understand what's going on. Let's go back about 200 years before John, just for a second. The Greeks were in control of the entire region because of a man we've probably heard of named Alexander the Great. At a very young age, Alexander's conquest paved the way for Greek culture to spread throughout the region, which included the land of Israel. It was 332 BC when Alexander had conquered Israel. After Alexander died, though, his military commanders divided up his kingdom into two areas, one controlled by a commander named Seleucus, forming the Seleucid dynasty, and the other controlled by the Ptolemies, based in Egypt. Originally, the land of Israel was included in the kingdom of the Ptolemies. There was relative peace, but in 198 BC, the Seleucids took over Israel under the command of Antiochus III. Then life in Israel took a major downturn when a Seleucid king, Antiochus IV, started ruling in 174 BC. Antiochus IV was full of pride and took the name Epiphanes for himself, which presumably meant select of God, but many people in his kingdom called him the madman. Antiochus wanted everyone in his empire to share the same culture, just like his predecessor Alexander the Great, and he also wanted everyone in his empire to worship the same gods. So he stepped up his campaigns to squash Judaism, beginning in 168 BC. He had any Jew who wouldn't worship the Greek idols put to death. Praying to Yahweh or observing the Sabbath became illegal. Mothers found with circumcised infants were killed along with the child. Antiochus also had many of the scrolls of the scriptures burned, although there were many that were saved by being hidden out in the wilderness. And just 6 years after taking power, he marches into Jerusalem, vandalized the temple, set up an altar to the Greek god Zeus, and desecrated the temple with the blood of pigs. This event was prophesied in the book of Daniel, specifically Daniel chapter 8. This set off a firestorm in Israel and really set a precedent in all of human history. No one in the ancient world had ever died for their gods. Only the Jews thought their religion was worth dying for. The Jews had the only monotheistic one at the time, meaning the only one faith that believed that there was one God, not many gods. But this war was not just a war against the Greeks. It was a civil war too, because many of the Jews who were loyal to Judaism, they fought against other Jews whose lifestyle and beliefs had already been deeply influenced by the Greeks. Shortly after, the Greek soldiers reached a town called Modin, which is about 12 miles northwest of Jerusalem. They demanded that the Jews there, specifically the local leader Mattathias, sacrifice a pig on a portable altar to the Greek gods. He refuses, but another Jew steps up and says that he would do it, but Mattathias is totally outraged and kills both the Jew and Antiochus' representative. Now many begin to join this resistance movement of sorts, and Mattathias had 5 sons. They all head for the hills, expecting for the Greek army to return and wipe out their whole village. They organize a small but a powerful force out in the wilderness, led by Judah or Judas. He would be nicknamed Judas Maccabee, and Maccabee just means the hammer. The Jews were only armed with spears, bows and arrows, and rocks, but the Greek army was well trained. They had equipment and even war elephants, which were like the tanks of the ancient world. Judas Maccabee and his army was vastly outnumbered, but their determination is what sustained them in the battles. In 164 BC, 3 years after the Maccabean Revolt began in 166, the Jews were able to retake Jerusalem. But they come in and find the temple completely desecrated. It's been turned into a pagan sanctuary where pigs had been sacrificed in the altar. Much of the gold had been melted down. The first thing they do when they re-enter the temple is to try to light a makeshift menorah, but they only find one vial of pure oil with the special seal on it. They use this oil to light the menorah, and it miraculously stays lit for 8 days. The retaking of the temple and this miracle of the oil is what's celebrated in the 8 days of Hanukkah, a word in Hebrew meaning dedication. The books of 1st and 2nd Maccabees detail the story of the Maccabean Revolt and the retaking of Jerusalem. Now, when we read the story of the Maccabees, it may seem like it's just something that takes place over a few weeks. The battles take place, the Jews win, and the Greeks go home. But in fact, it takes 25 years of fighting and a great many casualties on both sides until the Seleucid Greeks finally reach a peace agreement with the Jews. Now, Mattathias, the leader who refused to sacrifice the pig, was a priest in Israel. So naturally, after his sons had helped the Jews regain Jerusalem, Simon, one of Mattathias' sons, became the new high priest. Simon also took on himself a title that meant prince or leader, being careful not to call himself king. Because if you remember back in episode 13, we talked about how Israel's true king would be from David's line. And these guys, as priests, were from Aaron's line and couldn't rightfully be Israel's king. Unfortunately, though, Simon's descendants didn't respect this distinction, and a new dynasty is formed in Israel called the Hasmonean dynasty. These guys get pretty power hungry. After Simon dies, his son John Hyrcanus does something terribly anti-Jewish. As part of his efforts to expand Israel's borders and strengthen the country, he forces the people he conquers into converting to Judaism. This is something the Jews have never done before. Now, one of the families in the region of Idumea that's converted becomes very significant later on. A descendant of that family is a man named Herod, who, as we've already talked about in several past episodes, would later be appointed king of the Jews under the Romans. Now, a civil war between factions in the dynasty would later break out, and the Romans were called in to help arbitrate the dispute. And of course, as Rome was gaining power at the time, they were happy to come in and take charge of the land. So in 63 BC, after the Maccabean Revolt and 103 years after the Hasmonean dynasty's rule of Israel, the Roman general Pompey and his whole army take over the city. Pompey and his forces enter the temple and the Holy of Holies, defiling it. And it's at that time that Israel comes under Roman administration, and this is what sets us up for understanding where the nation of Israel is and politically where they're at during the time of Jesus. So what does all this have to do with John the Baptist? Remember, Israel hadn't heard from any of the Lord's prophets for over 400 years. Since that time, there had been many bloody conflicts. The temple had been desecrated, there was no Davidic king on the throne, and it seemed as if Yahweh had abandoned his people. Just think about how different things were in Israel during those years compared to the years of David and Solomon. It's been 1,000 years since those days. Imagine if you were Jewish, living in Israel at the time we've been looking at. You'd heard about the glory days of old, and more recently you've heard about the Maccabean Revolt and the Hasmoneans, and how what seemed so glorious in the beginning had just collapsed and become so horrible. And after defeating the Greeks but failing to keep control of their own nation, the Romans were now in charge, and Israel was no better off than they were 100 years ago. I imagine people were genuinely asking, where's our God in all of this? What about the covenants he made with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob? What about the Exodus from Egypt and the law and Mount Sinai? What about the promises to David of a king who would endure forever? What about the promises of being the head and not the tail? What about the prophets and everything they said about the restoration of the temple and of Jerusalem? It seemed like the Maccabean Revolt might have been a start to some of that, but now Rome, they seem even more powerful, and it seems like there's no hope for us. And so here we are, 26 AD, and a man named John goes out into the wilderness. He's gathering a lot of people to himself, just like Judas Maccabee did when he started his revolt. And he's talking like the prophets did, and he's dressed like them. So with the historical context we looked at, who were the people of Israel thinking that John was? And what was the message that he was proclaiming? Was he the Christ? Or was he the prophet? Or was he Elijah? These are the questions we see asked in John chapter 1. And they asked him, "What then? Are you Elijah?" He said, "I'm not." "Are you the prophet?" And he answered, "No." So they said to him, "Who are you? We need to give an answer to those who sent us. What do you say about yourself?" He said, "I am the voice of one crying out in the wilderness, 'Make straight the way of the Lord,' as the prophet Isaiah said." Now they had been sent from the Pharisees. They asked him, "Then why are you baptizing if you are neither the Christ, nor Elijah, nor the prophet?" John answered them, "I baptize with water, but among you stands one who you do not know, even he who comes after me, the strap of whose sandal I am not worthy to untie." These things took place in Bethany across the Jordan where John was baptizing. John identifies himself as the voice of Isaiah 40. He's crying out and he's saying, "God is coming, God is coming, God is coming, get ready." and he's administering the rite of baptism for those who would repent. The day of the Lord was at hand, and Israel, among all of the people that should be prepared, were not. This is so significant in light of everything we've looked at so far. In the next few episodes, we'll actually begin breaking down the message of John. Don't miss those. If you've missed any of the past episodes, you'll find them all on my website, www.joshuahawkins.com/gospels. If you want to receive a weekly email notification for these, enter your email address on the form on my website as well. God bless, and I'll see you next time.